September in Alaska is one of the most picturesque times of the year to visit the state. It's the month where summer just starts to lose its hold. The landscape turns crisp and clear, and it's sprinkled with the orange and yellow hues of autumn. This is also the final flurry of activity in the vast wilderness. Animals hurry to finish their winter dens and to eat what last living morsels are left growing to build up as much fat as they can for the long winter months ahead. Once the winter truly settles in, both animals and humans are confined by the snow and ice that blanket the landscape. Robert Harris Weaver, or Chupa as his friends liked to call him, and his wife Nina were taking advantage of the last of the good weather that September. Robert was an Alaskan native. The only time he'd left his home state for an extended period of time was to attend university. But once he got his degree and met Nina, he and his new wife came back to Robert's home. There, they'd raised their children, and Robert took over his old man's business. Now that the children were grown and out of the house, raising kids of their own, Robert was slowly phasing out of the family business, handing it over to his son, just like his father had done before him. Robert and Nina had the leisure of going hunting, fishing, or just staying at their cabin beside Lake George whenever they felt like it. However, this trip was a special one. Robert wanted to catch the last phase of the hunting season, hoping to bring down a moose for himself and maybe a few more to hand out to his grown-up children. They also planned to check on the cabin to get some last-minute repairs done and drop off a few supplies before the first snowfall of the season. After the season came to an end and the snowfall became too deep to navigate through, he and Nina were going to spend their first ever winter in their cabin alone. In the years before, their trips were always with their children or friends, and then only in the spring and summer. But since they were technically retired now, they wanted to have an unconventional second honeymoon by trapping themselves inside the comfy cabin for the whole winter, with only each other for company. In 2013, they didn't have the internet and satellites that we have today, so they were going to be severely limited in the amount of contact they could have with the outside world. But both of them were fit and healthy, so they weren't too worried about running into trouble. In the event that something were to happen to one of them, at least they had a satellite phone to call for help if they had to. And the ancient cell phones of the day did get signal from inside the cabin. The rest of their food, books, generators, and board games were already at the cabin, just waiting for the winter, so that they could be cracked open and enjoyed. If their hunt went well tomorrow, the two would return to town for the next few weeks, before coming back with the last of their supplies, just in time to lock themselves in for winter. On their second-to-last morning on the lake, the two headed out to go fishing before everything froze over solid. They came back to shore in the early afternoon. The cabin was just a short walk from the dock, but even so, it was already cold enough to want to get indoors before the late afternoon, when the temperature dropped and predators like wolves and lynxes had a habit of prowling around the lakeside. Robert had left his hunting rifle up at the cabin, and he didn't like the idea of being caught out in the open without a weapon to defend himself and his wife. Their thoughts of predators weren't unfounded at all. The area was known to have just about every animal in North America, and the extra activity that the autumn brought for the wildlife also came with the pre-winter jitters that animals had when they were hurrying to settle down, and they could be quite unpredictable at this time of year. They tied their boat to the dock and started to make their way back home. Robert was carrying the fishing poles and the tackle box, and Nina had her 2 buckets of fish. They chatted as they walked and kept their eyes on the uneven ground before them. It was easy to take a tumble over a rock or twist your ankle in an indentation in the ground. They walked about 100 yards up the slightly sloping hill before they started moving through bushes and the first growth of the forest. Another 50 yards ahead, in the thick of the trees, stood their 2-bedroom log house, almost completely hidden from view. A few hours before they arrived, an old male black bear had begun to poke around the place. It came from the forest that morning when it caught a whiff of something edible. The old bear found 2 trash cans and spent the morning ripping open the bags, rummaging through the contents, and eating whatever it could find. By the time Nina and Robert came back, the bear had left a mess of strewn garbage at the back of the cabin. and it was quite annoyed. The food sure smelled promising all the way out in the forest, but there was so little in the plastic bins that its stomach wasn't even close to capacity. It had wasted all of the morning on just a few scraps, and now it had to start looking for food all over again this late in the day. Just as it was about to leave, it caught the scent of something else: fish. The bear smelled Nina's catch long before it even heard the couple's approach. It was just picking up speed, jogging toward the smell, when it stopped short at the sight of the people walking toward it. Nina and Robert both had their heads down and didn't notice the animal standing in the crop of trees. For a moment, the bear took in the situation. It was hungry, and Nina definitely carried the source of the promising smell. But black bears preferred to avoid humans if they could. The old bear wasn't stupid. It knew very well that people might seem small and weak, but they were an unpredictable species, and this kind of bear was naturally wired to avoid them when they could. Standing very still, the male mulled over what to do, but before he could make up his mind, the people were coming dangerously close to where he was standing. It was becoming increasingly nervous about their proximity, and the added smell of fish was grating on his senses, adding fuel to the winter jitters. The people were now just a few meters away from the unstable bear, which reared on its hind legs, letting out an ear-splitting roar. Nina and Robert nearly jumped out of their skin at the sudden blast of sound from the trees. The bear stormed forward a few feet, trying to show off as much of its 230 pounds as it could in the hopes of intimidating them. It still wasn't quite sure how to approach the situation, so it waited for them to make the first move. Apparently, they reacted the wrong way. Nina was slightly ahead of her husband when she dropped her 2 buckets, spilling the contents over the rocks beneath her feet, and she screamed. Robert rushed forward, placing himself between the animal and his wife, yelling and waving his arms as he went. This wasn't the first time Robert had come across a black bear, and all of them, even the ones as big as this one, ran away if you made enough noise, but he'd never walked into one head-on. The creature saw this as a direct attack, and its instincts took over. Its velvet coat shook majestically as it sped over the ground at the man who was posing the greatest threat. It streaked at an alarming speed, covering the 12 or so meters between them in just a few strides. Robert managed to shout at Nina to run just before the bear's massive body slammed into him, forcing the air out of his lungs and sending him crashing into the ground. The bear and man skidded across the rocky lakeshore, the jagged rocks tearing away the back of Robert's jacket as they went. Nina ran, and she didn't look back to see the animal on top of her husband, tearing with its paws and teeth at Robert's chest and head. But she did hear his agonized screams and the murderous growls and roars from the bear behind her. Nina reached the cabin in seconds, yanked open the door, and grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall. Nina was confident enough with the rifle. She'd had many turns during target practice, but she'd never actually had to use the weapon to bring anything down. Running and fumbling with it, she loaded the rifle as she made her way back to where Robert was. But when the scene came into view, her stomach dropped. The man laying on the ground was no longer recognizable as Robert. His entire upper body had been mauled so badly that there was little left to see of him except copious amounts of blood and the shreds that were once his face. The animal was still on top of Robert, and somehow Robert was still alive, his arms feebly grabbing onto whatever piece of fur he could. In the seconds that Nina had taken to get the gun and come back, Robert's screams had turned into bloody gurgles and painful gasps. She raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. Click, click, click. Nothing happened. The gun was jammed tight, so she struck the nose of it against a nearby rock and fired again and again and again. Still nothing, just that empty click. Nina, desperate and panicked, threw the entire gun at the creature. When the heavy metal shaft hit the bear, it lifted Robert, who had now stopped moving, into the air by its jaws and threw him aside. Robert landed with the dead weight of a stone several feet away. Nina grabbed one of her plastic buckets and threw that at the bear too. Enraged beyond reason, the animal then rushed at Nina. With only seconds to react, she managed to get hold of a sizable rock and threw it at the approaching creature, hitting it square on the forehead. That last stone saved Nina's life. The beast was momentarily dazed as she realized just how close it was to her. She could smell the earth and blood on its body and see the chunks of her husband's skin stuck in its muzzle. Nina did the only wise thing she could. She ran. She didn't look back. She knew she only had a few seconds before the animal came to its senses. The rock was just enough to buy her those precious few seconds, and she pumped her legs harder than she had ever done in her life. She skidded through the open door of their cabin, shutting it behind her. The bear had turned back to Robert when it shook off the blow. Seeing that the woman was nearly at the house, it didn't bother to go after her, not when the other one was already taken care of. Inside the log building, Nina scrambled to find her cell phone. The satellite phone that they carried for emergencies was strapped to Robert's belt, and there was no way to get it now. She found it and dialed 911. Before the operator answered, Nina was at the window, but the bear and Robert were both gone. Even from a distance, she could see the bloody drag marks that led into the forest. Sobbing and nearly incoherent, she tried to explain what had happened to the woman who finally picked up at the other end of the line. It took a good 10 minutes before the operator had some idea of the situation and a rough set of directions to get to the secluded place in the Alaskan wilderness. This garbled set of instructions, given by the hysterical Nina, made it difficult for emergency helicopters to locate the cabin. But from the air, the pilots spotted their blue Jeep standing out against the green and yellow of the autumn trees. By that time, it was already evening, and poor Nina was still huddled with her back to the door. She was taken away by air to be treated for shock at the closest hospital, even before the search for Robert began. All through the night and well into the next morning, rescue personnel and almost every person in a 50-mile radius of the lake came out to help. By the light of day, they could follow the bloody trail and finally locate Robert's remains hidden in a dugout den. The animal had obviously feasted on the man through the night, but there was no sign of the bear yet, so the search was widened. If bears attack once, the likelihood of them doing it again is almost certain. They couldn't take any chances. But in the end, the bear found them first. It came back to continue its feeding on Robert's remains, only to find a trooper standing at his hidey hole, and its kill was gone, taken away to the morgue the night before. The animal knew, after killing Robert, that this was an opportunity for another easy meal to add to its winter stash. But unfortunately for the black bear, this trooper did not have a rifle that jammed at the wrong moment. He became aware of the movement behind him and discovered the animal obviously stalking him, ready to pounce on the man from behind. When the other searchers and troopers heard the 4 shots ring out across the forest, they converged to the source of the blasts. They found the trooper alive and well, with a fully grown black bear lying dead at his feet. It was later confirmed with a necropsy that the animal indeed had Robert's remains in its digestive tract, so at the very least, the danger was removed from the area. But the lake stood devoid of people for almost 2 years anyway. Nina gave the cabin and surrounding property over to her children, but they didn't want to set foot in the place where their father had died either. So, in the end, it was sold off to another family, who still makes use of it to this very day. But thankfully, no bear attacks have occurred there since Robert's terrifying final affliction.
The U.S. state of Montana is one of those places in the world that sparks adventure. The landlocked terrain is situated in the northern Rockies and Plains region in the northwestern United States. The 4th largest U.S. state boasts a whopping 147,000 square miles of area, peppered with brilliant mountain ranges in the western third of the state. The pristine wilderness and spectacular scenery are Mother Nature's way of showing off its wonderful creation. Animals including white-tailed deer, wolverines, elk, and even predators like black bears, coyotes, and wolves all coexist in the dazzling American landscape. Among them, however, is one of the world's most feared predators, the grizzly bear. Even the most experienced mountaineers, hikers, and adventurers are wary of these brown beasts of destruction. Sharing the land with these intelligent, powerful creatures should be carefully considered upon visiting Montana. Although grizzly bears seldom attack, when they do, it's a terrifying exhibit. On August 26, 2005, father and daughter Johan and Jenna Otter were hiking in Montana's Glacier National Park. Unfortunately, they happened to be at the wrong place and time as they felt the wrath and power of a mother grizzly bear. It was August 18, 2005, a week before Johan and Jenna's trip to Montana. With September just around the corner, Jenna's time was limited as she was headed to the University of California, Irvine as a freshman. The two decided to go on a memorable trip to celebrate Jenna's new chapter in life. They chose to hike at Glacier National Park. While Jenna was a young, athletic dancer, Johan was a runner who often participated in marathons. Consequently, a hike at a beautiful location seemed the perfect bonding option. August 25th, the day of the trip, arrived. Johan woke up early, excited to head to the trail before anyone else. After all, yesterday was a rainy disappointment. However, today was different as the sun rays beamed through the clouds, coloring yellow the misty Montana wilderness. The two headed up the trail at around 7:30 a.m., ready for the ambitious hike ahead. Unbeknownst to them, this trip would test them in ways they could not have ever predicted. A thick carpet of thimbleberries sprinkled the bushes along the path. Other wildflowers like beargrass and lilies grew underneath the spruce and pine. Walking along Lake Josephine, the two managed to cover a great distance. Johan and Jenna were already above the tree line within 40 minutes of their hike. They gazed at the beautiful surrounding peaks lightly covered in snow. The two were in awe at the park's grandiosity. Continuing their journey, the hikers talked loudly to not surprise any bears that might be hiding in the bushes. They were well aware of the dangers and practiced precautionary measures diligently as they'd been taught to do. Approaching the southern flank of Mount Grinnell, the two fell silent as they stared at the snow-covered peaks glistening under the Montana morning. Johan felt grateful Jenna still wanted to participate in what he called a senior trip. The day could not have gone more perfectly. This would be an unforgettable day indeed, however, not in the way that they imagined. Although she felt safe knowing her father was with her, Jenna had an underlying feeling of nervousness. This was born from the knowledge that early hours were the time for feeding for various animals. Along the way, Johan took out his video camera and decided to record the park's natural beauty. The pine trees in the distance looked like strokes of paint painstakingly done by a masterful artist, ensuring every detail was unique. "Dad, let's go. We've got a long way to go," Jenna urged her father, who was standing there still awestruck behind his camera. To her, Johan looked like an easy target, but Jenna quickly dispersed the thoughts. Johan understood this and quickly removed himself from the trance. Being the seasoned marathoner he was, Johan caught up to her in no time at all. Bear attacks in the park were extremely rare, considering the millions of visitors flocking annually. During these hikes, experts recommend carrying a can of bear spray, a non-lethal defense against potential predators. And this was precisely what Johan and Jenna did. However, they made one crucial mistake. The can was placed inside Johan's backpack. This was common practice though, as many people think attacks wouldn't really happen to them, until it does. The two climbed higher into the trail. If anything should happen to them, Johan and Jenna were to deal with the problem on their own. They continued to talk, unwittingly walking into territory that would soon change their lives. As they headed farther up, the clouds cleared, revealing the spectacular view of the mountains and lakes. This prompted Johan to take his camera again, and the two fell silent once more. Walking up the trail ahead of her father, Jenna reached a bend that hid whatever was behind it, and there it was, a large brown silhouette pacing in front of her. Before she could fully comprehend what she was seeing, Jenna's heart had already sunk to her stomach. The large grizzly bear mother walked towards her, followed by two yearling cubs. It was the worst possible scenario. The bear's most excellent danger detection tool is its nose. However, the wind was blowing down the mountain at the time. This prevented the animal from detecting the approaching father and daughter. A surprised bear, especially a mother grizzly, is highly aggressive and immensely dangerous. It was a perfect concoction of bad timing and bad luck. Turning away from the massive beast, Jenna began to run out of panic. She yelled to her father, warning him about the bear. Jenna was sure she was going to die. Turning his head towards his daughter's yelling, Johann saw the massive grizzly bear coming up behind her. He knew they didn't stand a chance. However, a primal instinct swelled inside his chest, overtaking the fear and panic. Without hesitation and without thinking, Johann stepped across Jenna, blocking the charging creature with his body. The bear went into attack mode, biting Johann's thigh with its frightening jaws laced with 3-inch canines. Seeing the horror unfold from only a few feet away, Jenna could do nothing but scream. Next to the polar bear, a grizzly bear's bite sits at an immense force of 1,160 psi, enough to crush a bowling ball without the creature even flinching. The grizzly locked onto Johann's thigh, clamping on the bone like a jackhammer. Johann's gravely desperate screams reflected the searing pain that he felt. It filled the quiet atmosphere of the park. Eventually, the bear readjusted its bite, going in and out of the flesh. Amid the unfolding terror, Johann managed to think clearly. He realized he needed to break loose to survive. Quickly observing the area, Johann noticed the mountain face was on his right, but to his left, a sharp drop. However, behind him, shy of 20 feet, was an alder patch on a slight slope from the cliff. Johann immediately dove into the bushes, landing on his side. His head spun and his teeth clattered upon impact, but he was okay. His right eye was already bleeding, but there was no time to tend to his wounds. Jenna was left with the bear. "Down here," Johann yelled at Jenna, instructing her to jump toward him. Jenna saw the can of bear spray and immediately went to pick it up. However, she didn't know how to work the can. Without time to read the instructions, Jenna realized she needed to get away. Without hesitation, she leaped towards the cliff, not knowing where she was landing. Though the possibility of death crossed her mind, it was on her terms, better than getting mauled into pieces by an angry apex predator. However, Johann didn't know this and continued to yell at his daughter. The bear cocked its head, looking down at him from the alder patch. It had his scent, and there was no fooling it. Poking its head from the slope, the bear pounced on Johann, covering the 20-foot distance like it was nothing. Johann had never seen something move so solid and so fast. Forced into a fetal position, Johann was partially protected by his pack. However, the bear was keen on finishing him to protect her cubs. The creature lifted Johann from the bushes with its mouth, attempting to flip him. It clawed at his back, slashing his clothes and tearing his skin apart. Johann's mind started to race. All he wanted to do was keep the bear away from Jenna. The next thing he knew, he fell 30 feet down, hitting the ground with his face. He was rattled, bruised, and severely injured, but he was alive. When Johann regained composure, he realized he had landed on the same ledge Jenna was on. However, the bear was still after him. Johann accidentally brought the grizzly straight to Jenna. Standing on its hind legs, the bear cocked its head back and forth, letting loose a deafening growl. Seeing the beast, Johann and Jenna scrambled for safety, but there was nowhere to go. The bear dropped to its massive front paws and went in for the kill, charging the defenseless father and daughter. Jenna tried to hide behind a nearby bush, but Johann decided to stay within the creature's sights, putting on a brave face and facing it head-on. As mighty and immovable as the bear was, Johann's determination to protect his daughter was just as unstoppable. Johann grabbed the nearest weapon he could find, a sharp rock. However, it quickly crumbled into dust in his hands. The bear's amber-brown eyes stared straight into Johann's fearful face. It was like staring down the barrel of a shotgun. Johann was certain his life was over. The fight was on again. The bear chomped down on Johann's arm, piercing the flesh and locking its jaws onto the bone. Johann fought hard, but he was simply no match for the bear's strength. From a few feet away, Jenna watched in horror. She resisted the temptation of trying to help her father in the scuffle. The bear went for Johann's head, tearing his scalp off and chewing on the bone. He felt his skull cracking, and he screamed at the painful horror. Johann knew this might be the end if he didn't do anything. He was at a crossroads, either fall from the cliff and possibly die on his terms, or get mauled by the bear, a guaranteed painful death. It was a reasonably easy deduction. Breaking free from the bear's grip, Johann jumped into the void and landed on a ledge 20 feet away from the commotion. Luckily, a small rocky ridge saved him from certain death. He looked up and saw the bear poking its head from the cliff. The steepness between him and the creature saved him from getting attacked again. However, Jenna was still in danger. Sniffing human flesh in the air, the bear scored the area for Jenna. As it approached the bushes where she hid, Jenna felt the bear's panting on her neck. Her stomach churned in fear. Eventually, the bear attacked again. Its massive jaws chomped on her head, ripping her lower jaw open. However, a sense of clarity washed over her. Jenna decided to play dead and stay as still as possible. It worked. The bear left the scene, convinced the threat was neutralized. Terrified the bear might come back if he made a sound, Johan stayed still for 2 grueling minutes. Eventually, he couldn't remain still. He had to check on Jenna. Bleeding profusely, Johan worked through the pain to prop himself up against the mountain face. There were no sounds from the ledge above. Suddenly, Jenna's voice pierced through the eerie silence. Johan was filled with gratitude. Johan touched his head and could feel only bone. He explored no further, realizing he was severely injured. He reached for his nylon jacket and protected his exposed scalp. Unfortunately, the adrenaline in his body was wearing off, and he was in danger of going into shock. Meanwhile, Jenna screamed as loud as she could. "Help!" she repeated at the top of her lungs. Eventually, other hikers heard her, prompting their rescue 2 hours later. Johan and Jenna were airlifted to the nearby hospital. Johan's spine and neck were severed in the attack, and his scalp needed a skin graft. He had a punctured eye, a broken nose, and broken ribs. However, his ego was intact. More importantly, he protected Jenna. After 9 operations and several months in the hospital, Johan fully recovered. Meanwhile, Jenna also underwent surgery. She began university wrapped in bandages. They say a man's true character shows in the face of certain death. Johan showed he had a heart of gold and guts made of titanium. Although the incident was terrible, it could have been prevented had the two gone over and reviewed their precautionary measures. Certainly, Jenna could have learned how to use the bear spray before heading onto the hike. Additionally, the bear spray canister could have been kept by Johan's side where he could reach it easily. Fortunately, the two could reflect on these hard lessons as they were given another chance at life, thankful for each new day after narrowly escaping their final affliction.
On 16th of September 2011, 39-year-old Steve Stevenson headed to a Montana forest. He was out on a hunting trip. He had secured his license to hunt black bears in the woodland along the Montana-Idaho border and joined a group of 3 others. They were each permitted to hunt for black bears in both states, either side of the border. Steve was a devoted husband and a father to 2 young daughters, aged 14 and 10. He worked as a miner for a company called Highcroft, mining for silver and gold. In his spare time, he considered himself as an outdoorsman. He loved hiking in the wilderness, amongst nature, amongst friends. He'd also been hunting in this region before on many occasions. Overall, Steve was excited for their hunting trip together. They were ready to hunt some black bears. As the group hiked into the wilderness, their small talk turned to the job at hand, the prospect of shooting one of nature's greats. After about 3 miles into their trip, Steve and 20-year-old Ty Bell paired off to cover more ground. They often hunted alone, coming together at the end of the day, but they knew grizzly bears were in the area. In fact, they had seen signs of grizzly bears, and they knew it was safer to hunt in pairs. They had said if they saw a grizzly, they would leave and come back another time. As they scoured the woodland for signs of black bears, they climbed a ridge to scout even further. High up on the ridge, the men could see across the valley. At first, there was no sign of any bears, but then Ty thought he spotted one. The 2 men stopped in their tracks. A little distance away, Ty had seen a flash of fur. Something large moved amongst the bushes, its head low to the ground, foraging, perhaps for berries, roots, and leaves. Ty raised his rifle to his eye. He aimed it at the bushes and looked along his scope. As the bear stepped out from behind a bush, Ty pulled the trigger. A single shot rang out. The bear lurched and then ran off into the dense woodland. Steve and Ty waited 15 minutes before following the blood trail. They needed to be sure the bear was dead before they went after it. A wounded beast is the most dangerous of them all. Little did the two men know they hadn't shot a black bear. Instead, they had shot its much more aggressive cousin, a grizzly, one of only 45 known to inhabit the Cabinet Yaak ecosystem area. The hunting of grizzlies was illegal in the region, as it was in all 48 lower states. Overhunting had largely decimated the grizzly population over the past century, but through protection and the banning of hunting, their numbers have somewhat recovered in recent decades. Hunters hunting in the state of Montana are required to take a bear identification course. In the thick of the woodland, when the animals are obscured from view, it can be difficult to tell them apart. Often a hunter will just see a flash of fur. They will just catch a glimpse of it, and then they have to make a split-second decision there and then whether to take the shot or not. They are all still classified as an endangered species, though, so the mistaken identity of this grizzly could have meant bad news for Ty, who had now, unintentionally, just broken the law. But the bad news was about to get worse. As the blood trail took the two hunters into the thickest of the forest, they suddenly heard a noise, the snap of a twig, the grunting and snorting of a large animal. They knew they were close. They realized that they had made their first mistake. They knew that the shot hadn't killed the bear, but they hadn't left enough time for it to die. Peering around a tree, the two men saw it. To their disbelief, a 400-pound, 180-kilogram brown bear stood waiting for them. It wasn't a black bear, as they had originally thought. It was a wounded grizzly, the most dangerous of its kind. And now, it was cornered too. Its breathing was labored, its eyes fixed on the two men. It lowered its head, its ears pricked back as it ran at them, launching its attack. The two men instinctively raised their rifles and began shooting at the bear. But it didn't slow down. It didn't flinch or veer off its path. It kept coming at them. Stephen yelled at the bear. He waved his arms above his head, trying to distract it, as he saw that it was fixated on Ty. He was trying to get the bear to come for him rather than his young hunting companion. He was trying to protect the 20-year-old. That was the kind of man he was. He wouldn't have thought twice about it. He purely acted on instinct. A genuinely kind-hearted man who would do anything to protect those around him. It worked. The bear covered the ground between them in less than a few seconds and diverted its attention to Stephen. Then it was on top of him. Ty lifted his gun and pointed it at the bear. He fired a shot. The bear began to maul Stephen. Ty could hear his friend's cries. He could see the man underneath the animal, scrabbling about, trying to push the huge bear off him, but its weight was too much. Its claws slashed Stephen's legs and torso. Its canine teeth tore into his face. He kicked with his feet, but it was too much. He couldn't get the bear off him. Ty pulled his trigger again and again, each time reloading. Each time trying to keep his cool, trying to load the gun with trembling fingers and his heart thumping loudly in his chest. Several shots rang out, one after the other in quick succession. They hit the bear in its side. Ty could see the impact of each shot as they pummeled the bear's fur, embedding deep within its body. But the bear was relentless in its attack. It didn't slow down, and it didn't give up. The bullets only enraged it further, the adrenaline surging through its enormous body, masking any pain that must have been building. Then he fired another shot at the bear, and it climbed off Stephen, stumbled a few feet, and fell to the ground. Its body lay slumped next to Stephen. Ty rushed over to his friend. He held Stephen's head in his hands and urged him to wake up, but Stephen lay still. He did not move. He did not utter a sound. He was dead. Blood poured from his gaping wounds, but he also had a single gunshot wound in his chest. Ty had shot his friend. In the heat of the moment, amongst all the commotion and chaos, he had accidentally hit Stephen in the chest. No one knows whether the bullet hit the bear first and came ricocheting through its body and into the father of two, or whether Ty had shot Stephen directly. Either way, Stephen was dead, and it was a tragic end. As Stephen lay motionless on the ground, Ty made the desperate and agonizing call to the authorities. He had lost his friend. What was supposed to be an incredible adventure, an enjoyable time spent in the great outdoors, had ended in tragedy, and it was his fault. Soon, he heard the sound of a chopper overhead. He directed the rescue team to his location, and Stephen's body was lifted out of the woodland and handed over to the Lincoln County authorities in Montana. An autopsy was performed at the Montana State Crime Lab, and it was confirmed that although Stephen had sustained injuries from the bear during the attack, particularly to his legs, he had actually died from the gunshot wound to his chest. Ty had unintentionally killed his friend while attempting to save his life. He was traumatized by the news that it was him who had killed Steve, not the bear. He was torn by the fact that if he had remained a bit more calm and focused, Steve might have survived. The bear was taken to a lab in Bozeman. It was weighed and determined to be a male and was estimated to have been between 6 and 8 years old. Sadly, bear attacks claim the lives of 5 or 6 individuals in the United States every year. But this time it wasn't the bear to blame for the loss of life. Ty received no charges from authorities from this incident, and it was considered to be an accident. From the amount of bullets it took to stop the bear, it's likely that even if Ty hadn't shot Steve, he would have still met his terrifying final affliction.